welcome to the 2023 Emerging Issues webinar series, a collaboration between the FTCOE and ASCLD. Our third and final webinar of the series is Stress, Trauma, and Burnout in Forensic Scientists. Our first presenter is Mandy Tinkey, Laboratory Director for the Allegheny County Office of the Medical Examiner. She will present vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout, recognition, realizations, and the need for peer support and personal wellness. Up next, we will hear from Danya Slack, RTI International's Department of Justice Strategic Account Executive. She will present Stress and Trauma in Forensic Scientists, Review of the Literature and Trends from a Cross-Sectional Study. Moderating the Q&A today is Nelson Santos, the Principal Scientist at RTI International. Without further delay, here are Mandy and Danya.
Hello, I am honored to be speaking with you today. I've spent the majority of my career in some level of leadership. It's for that reason that these topics have become so important to me. The wellness of your team members should always be a top priority. It's also always vital to remember that you cannot pour from an empty cup, no matter what level you're at and what role you're responsible for. I'm especially honored to have been recommended to deliver this event to you by peers in my field, colleagues that each day I learn from, rely on, and grow with. Today, I would like to speak to you about a few key topics that include an understanding of what vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout are, and how to recognize signs of those in yourself and in others. I would also like to discuss some principles learned over time in regards to self-care, peer support, and employee wellness. I would like to offer a disclaimer. My education is in chemistry and forensic science. My career has been in forensics, specifically drug chemistry and crime scene, in education, teaching at the collegiate level, and in leadership, both in medical legal death investigations and forensic laboratories. I'm providing this information to you today from my experiences and from the incredible people I've had the privilege to know along the way. I am not a mental health professional. I am in no way an expert. I learn new information about all of these topics every day from education, resources, peers, and personal reflection. My goal today is to plant even one seed that may inspire you to research something we talk about today, either for yourself or for your team. So let's jump right in. Vicarious trauma is defined as reliving in one's mind the events another person has experienced. This is an indirect exposure, as the individual did not experience the event themselves. However, they are provided all or the majority of the details of the event. This could be reading interviews, medical records, investigations. Individuals exposed to these events continually fall victim to what is considered vicarious trauma, and over time, the signs and symptoms start to bleed into their lives. Things like nightmares of the images representing those events, sleeplessness or avoidance to sleep to prevent those nightmares, calling off from work or absenteeism, avoiding family or friends, a doom and gloom attitude and an inability to see the optimism or the joy, perhaps even headaches, anxiety, stomach issues, medical conditions that might actually be related to stress. Compassion fatigue is another key term heard often in public safety and most commonly helping professions. Working directly with people means you learn about those people and their experiences. Answering the call to the service of helping people means you enter deeper into those details, giving so much of yourself in order to remain open, inviting, and compassionate. Over time, pouring all of yourself into that type of work results in an empty cup. Hitting a limit sometimes can be physically seen. It may appear as irritability, anger or a very short fuse, trouble sleeping, loss of focus, complete exhaustion that is difficult to explain. As that cup gets more depleted, the signs and frequency grow. In the field of forensics, situations arise every day that are traumatic. Various trauma events, such as vicarious trauma, may look like reading case reports that go into great detail about a horrible tragedy someone experienced, reviewing and examining evidence items directly from traumatic incidents. It could also be appearing in court to provide testimony and being asked questions, both on the stand and in pretrial conferences, about the work completed while also reviewing yet again the details of those tragic situations. If you work in fields of public safety where there is direct exposure to victims or survivors, the potential for compassion fatigue increases exponentially. Providing assistance and compassion for families as they navigate one of the most difficult times of their lives is a necessary function. The individuals who take on that challenge are nothing short of exceptional, but all of that focus helping others takes a toll on the helper. Another key factor to recognize in forensics is that right now there seems to be an elevation in line of duty critical incidents. The public safety community is a small one when we see line of duty deaths, suicide of those in public safety. That is recognized by many across all jurisdictions. That adds more levels of trauma and more levels of stress to an already saturated system. It is very important to recognize for any team and any workplace that all of our team members have lives and purposes outside the walls of our agency. We just talked a lot about the challenges our line of work presents for us, but we are people and we are human. Life happens. The work we do is confidential. The work we do is traumatic. For that reason, the details of the work stays at the office. If only that were actually true, right? We all know while we don't speak of it, there are days where those cases travel home with us in our heads, and it is very difficult to shake. We live in a world of gray. There is no black and white. There is no invisible barrier where we can leave it all behind. So instead, we must find ways to cope when we have that residue. Life happens though, and we have a laundry list of other things that may be weighing on our minds. Home, maybe our hot water tank broke. Family, maybe we have a family illness or trouble communicating with a spouse or a close relative. Perhaps finances, some unexpected bill popped up. Maybe it's commitments and feeling like you're spread way too thin. All of these things require our energy, our focus, and our time. When our time, focus, and energy become too divided, it begins to feel impossible to make everything work. That brings us to burnout. Burnout may be felt in every fiber of a person. Everyone knows the feeling of stress all too well. Stress is in all of our lives for a number of reasons. Perhaps you have a large project or deadline at work. That causes stress to get it done. Perhaps you're planning a large party at your home. That causes stress to make sure each detail is just as you want it. That stress is common, it's real. People react differently to stress, but often the stress drives a person. That may cause them to seem overly engaged, hyperactive, and that stress takes a physical toll as it grows. But often it ends or lessens when the stressor ends. Burnout is another story. Burnout is prolonged, continuous stress. Burnout leaves the person feeling broken. They may feel like they lose a piece of themselves, lose motivation, and lose focus. They may feel helpless, like they are no longer making the difference that they set out to, and the stress then takes an emotional toll on the person. Now, after discussing vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout, we talked of all of the signs and symptoms. Those were all very similar. The most important take home after discussing all of those signs is awareness. Awareness not only in your peers and your team members, but also awareness in yourself. It's very easy to end a long shift or a long week or a long year and notice you are perhaps a bit out of sorts. It's easier to fall back to perceptions of the past and say, it's just part of the job. This is normal and it's just part of choosing to work in this field. It's not just part of the job. The reaction is understandable and the reaction should be felt and dealt with. Not dealing and acknowledging and not being aware may result in losing who you are, maybe just a little, and maybe for just a little while. While not irreversible, it can become a mountain to climb. So, is it even possible to present any type of prevention for any types of trauma and prevent them from impacting our lives? The short answer is no. But maybe we can lighten the load. Reminding ourselves to focus on ourselves is very important. Taking care of ourselves helps in prevention because while we may not escape, we may learn to carry and then unpack the load better. Some ideas may include monitoring sleep. Make sure we're getting enough. We are not built to run on 4 hours a night. Physical exercise, move yourself. Take care of your body so it can take care of you. Take care of your mind. Meditation, breathing exercises. This allows a person to slow themselves down and open their eyes. Bring themselves awareness and self compassion to realize they are human and they deserve a break. An ability to foster and cultivate healthy relationships outside of work is very valuable. People need people. Now, you can't Google, "What self care do I need?" and expect to get an answer. A vital realization is that there is no one size fits all. Each person must find what works to fill their cup, and what works one day may not work the next day for that same person. The self care wheel you see here is a great example of key factors that every person must consider in order to identify what needs they must fulfill. The self care wheel is a very popular tool you can find through the Olga Phoenix Project. The practice allows you to first acknowledge and understand the variety of significant factors one must recognize and then define for themselves, as well as how to replenish those factors when they run dry. Once again, finding your spirit and your motivation. Now that we've discussed how important it is to take care of ourselves, how can we take care of each other? Peer support is such a priceless tool for any team. Those around us are the ones who will notice things we don't see for ourselves. The decision to create a peer support team starts with your needs and your goals. Each agency may vary in both of those definitions. Once the decision has been made to create a structure, where do you start? Do not reinvent the wheel. Seek help. When my agency began to focus on establishing a team, we started by talking to our clinicians who had previously assisted us in the past in all of our events. And we also reached out to our local network who had similar needs and goals. It was with their help that a foundation could be built. Making the goal clear to all of those who want to be involved is important. People who want to volunteer their time, to lend their shoulder, devote their awareness. Peer support is something that needs to be a volunteer basis and never be forced. It is very important to make sure that all understand the importance of this goal. Confidentiality is without question the most vital aspect of peer support. The goal is being there for one another, and the goal is connecting people and resources. None of those things are sustainable without trust and confidence that are built through confidentiality. Continual training is valuable for a peer support team to help those members to find ways to engage, to actively listen, and to identify resources. So when a peer is in need, peer support can be there. Peer support also isn't just within your own organization. Engaging in peer support events with other groups allows a variety of perspectives. Train and engage with EMS, fire, police, dispatch, coroners, medical examiners, forensic scientists. Widen your circle. Learn about their reactions. It's easy to convince yourself that it's hard to find anyone who you can talk to because unless you do the work we do, you can't understand. The reality is, our community is large and small all at the same time. Expand your network. Learn from the experiences of others. Use the relationships as building blocks to establish those connections that extend beyond time and distance. It is those connections that often prove to be some of the more loyal and longest lasting. They are far enough away for new perspective, yet also close enough for comfort. Those expanded networks are also some of the best sources for identifying local and online resources. If you're looking for new ideas for self care, maybe considering a therapist, or you're just looking for tools to navigate life for a while, those might be helpful. Now, how does an agency develop employee wellness resources when we talked earlier about every person's needs being different? The age old adage remains true: you can't please everyone. You also must look at what opportunities you may have available at your agency to determine what initiatives you can focus on. Providing resources and a wide and expansive variety is a great place to start. Let your team decide for themselves what they need. Developing and nurturing a culture of peer support, inclusivity, and caring is important. We have planned office events here, such as luncheons, breakfasts, or coffee sessions, just to bring people together for even just a little bit of time. We've also planned out of office events, such as happy hours, picnics, crafting events, such as board and brushes. These are things that may not be everyone's cup of tea, so always be open to suggestions and new ideas to help continue that variety. On several occasions, whether for a random employee wellness event or even following a really difficult case, we have brought in various animal assistance organizations for pet therapy, which our team absolutely loves. Each week, I email out a weekly resource newsletter created with the help of our team to bring event notices, articles, self care ideas, or just additional resources to people's fingertips. It's all about connecting people to information and letting them decide for themselves what they actually need. Now, I am a firm believer in setting the tone at the top. When a person enters into leadership, it's important to remember that you're setting an example. Your team may look to you for guidance, and that seeking might be done in silent observation. It's important to remember that leaders make mistakes. We too are human. We too fall victim to all of the things we spoke about today. Being honest with yourself and your team about that factor sets a tone for all. All team members, whether in leadership positions or boots on the ground, need to feel supported. They all need to know that there are people in their corner ready to catch them if they fall. I encourage all of my leadership team to, as much as possible, remain involved with their team members, encourage them, support them, be a walk around leader. Be aware when your team member is working through a difficult case or when their case management has left their cup empty. Being aware of your team members and their reactions allows you to be the best support system you can be for them. Remember again, every person's different. Some need more and some need less support or encouragement than others. We're all human. These actions build a culture. A culture finds a way to deal with their stressors rather than bury them until an inevitable overflow occurs. Finally, now we have to remember to help the helpers. Those helpers may be team members actively working in this very difficult field. Those helpers may be peer support team members who are slipping down a slope of compassion fatigue. Those helpers may be leaders. As people grow in their careers and enter into roles of leadership, it may at times feel that the community shrinks. You go from being in the midst of a very large team environment and slowly move into smaller, closer circles as the leadership rank grows. There are things leaders may not be able to say. There are things leaders may become even harder for them to admit about their personal challenges because they always have their team and setting an example in the forefront of their minds. You may be amazed to realize how much of an impact it makes to walk up to your section leader, your quality manager, or your lab director, or your chief, and just say, "Hey, how are you doing today?" I would like to finish up by talking today about onboarding. When a new employee starts a new position, there's always the first day with HR, where you learn about all of the work rules and your benefits. Also covered is often employee assistance programs. My agency and HR department has a wonderful EAP setup, and it's important, though, to continually remind your team that those resources are there 6 months later, a year later, 5 years later. During onboarding for our office, we complete a new hire checklist specific to our office and the divisions that individual is entering. This is done after the general HR related information is covered. One of those topics that we have added is mental wellness and peer support. I personally meet with each new person on these topics, whether you've joined our morgue operations or our laboratory operations team. I want new people to know why this information is important to me and what experience I've seen over the years. Topics we cover generally will include new person jitters. Some people may feel they don't want to speak too loudly or divulge too much because they're new. Encouraging them that it's okay to reach out to someone is important. I also talk to people about what to expect. I once had an opportunity to hear a phenomenal and inspiring speaker about PTSD and mental wellness, and he made a comment that resonated with me. We teach and train people to do their jobs. The firefighter how to make a rescue, a police officer how to apprehend an assailant, a scientist to perform testing, a death investigator to interview a family. But how often do we teach or train people on what happens after the task is done? How often do we talk about going home with a fuse shorter than expected, finding yourself hypersensitive to everything around you, not being able to sleep at night? Talking about that reality during onboarding sets a tone and creates an awareness. There's always going to be individuals that come in and say, I feel like I was made for this, and nothing that I am going to see, read, hear, smell, or experience is going to bother me. I try to deliver the reality to them. It's not if, it's when. Introducing those new team members to resources and support helps create the path that they may travel down moving forward. Now, as we wrap up, I'd like to remind everyone that no one ever has to stand alone. Whether you're interested in building a peer support structure for your agency, asking where to start for employee wellness resources, are a leader who is struggling with a challenge on your plate, or maybe you're a team member feeling isolated or just needing an outlet to get out whatever is on your mind. We are all in this together. We are all one community. Here's all of my contact information. I am always open and available if anyone from any agency wants to reach out via phone, via email. I'd love to talk with you more. I would love to allow you to share in any of the experiences, good and bad, that we have had to hopefully make something beneficial for your agency to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandy. We will now turn things over to Danya.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk to you today about stress and trauma and forensic scientists. I'm going to briefly go over the literature, and then I'm going to give some trends from a cross-sectional study that was just performed at the end of last year. So again, I'm Donnie Slack at RTI International. I wear a couple of hats. I am the Department of Justice Account Executive for the Institute, ensuring that all of the mission and vision of the DOJ is aligned with what RTI supports for this important client. And I am also the Executive Program Manager of the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, or the NAMUS program. And then I also am a doctoral candidate at Nova Southeastern University in South Florida, a fantastic PhD program recommended to anybody. And this is where the results of this study are primarily supported. So the nature of the problem, there are a lot of different disciplines, specific roles across forensic science. So some of them involve direct exposure. So you can think of things like crime scene investigators or forensic nurses, medical legal death investigators, those that usually attend the scene or are collecting from victims themselves, as in the case with forensic nurses. And then there are some that are more indirect exposure. So those could include those bench scientists, including DNA analysts, serologists, toxicologists, other drug chemists, fingerprint and pattern evidence examiners, trace examiners, and even some of the digital evidence examiners when they're not also performing investigations directly with victims. So there are a lot of prolonged job strains that have an effect on the workplace, and that could include workplace accidents, and then just decision-making and one's ability to actually perform a job. So a lot of times scientists have stated that there are lots of job strains in the forensic scientist. So that is one of the natures of the problem here for this study. So I'm just going to go over a little bit of background and significance of this problem. So first, I wanted to just level set that there's a vernacular to stress and trauma. And sometimes they are confounded, actually. So sometimes people will use them interchangeably. And sometimes that's okay, but sometimes they're actually quite different. So I just wanted to do a few definitions here for the rest of the study to make sense. So first, there's the post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of people are aware of this. That includes things that are usually just direct trauma. So you can think of a lot of military personnel exhibit direct trauma. So PTSD is high in them, along with a lot of first responders involved in a lot of active engagement. There are over 600,000 ways for an individual to actually meet the criteria for trauma according to the DSM-5. And it is pretty pervasive with people who do have these punctuated events of trauma. Then there's secondary traumatic stress. So that is actually closer to PTSD. And actually, some would argue that they are one and the same and that they're not two different versions of trauma. But this is actually called compassion fatigue in a lot of the literature. And this was done in 1995 when a researcher named Figley actually decided that secondary traumatic stress sounded a little bit too stigmatizing. So he came up with compassion fatigue to be able to give that a different name. So this is usually with people who have direct contact with trauma survivors, but are not usually involved in an ongoing or empathetic relationship with a victim. And it's very readily studied in first responders and medical professionals and the legal community. And it really presents itself as a lot of exhaustion, avoidance, hypervigilance. And it can actually occur from like a punctuated event, such as a mass disaster. Next, we have vicarious trauma. So this is a prolonged and cumulative exposure to traumatic materials. And it doesn't necessarily involve any exposure to the actual victim or someone experiencing the trauma themselves. It doesn't have to happen firsthand. It can be from this exposure to materials of traumatic content. So this actually leads to a disruption in an individual's idea of their own safety, their own esteem, their own assumptions about themselves and the world. And it actually can be permanent, and it's a compounded effect that does lead to permanent challenges that these individuals experience. And this was first studied in therapists by McCann and Perlman in the 90s. But there are a lot of studies that are lacking when it comes to various populations in the criminal justice system that are specific to vicarious trauma. So just a few notable studies, and this is not comprehensive of all the studies. These were just somewhat interesting. For crime scene investigators, some of the studies have been qualitative and some are quantitative. And one that I thought was interesting was this one done in 2017, where it determined that crime scene investigators do like to distance themselves from their cases, and they actually prefer to see the victims as carriers of forensic evidence. So it's a way that they're kind of coping with some of the traumatic things that they come across on a day-to-day basis. If they look at it just as evidence as opposed to people, it helps them cope. 2019, there was a great study done where it looked at CSIs, several hundred of them, about 225, and they actually have very negative beliefs about themselves, the others, and the world, and they did feel hypervigilant. So while this one didn't exactly study vicarious trauma, it did look like maybe these individuals were exhibiting vicarious trauma just based on these answers. This other study done in 2015 actually showed that crime scene investigators felt that their mistakes were a little bit more visible than their law enforcement counterparts, and 60% felt that they did not have sufficient manpower to do the job, and only 36% actually felt appreciated. They actually exhibited a lot of illnesses, including headaches, upset stomachs, trouble sleeping, fatigue, and they just felt overworked in general. And then a study done in 2012 actually measured variable heart rate over the course of 7 days in crime scene investigators. And it showed that CSIs are actually in a continual state of physical stress. And they had increased heart rates even from walking into a disorderly scene, not necessarily traumatic, just disorganized. And even doing paperwork stressed them out. So their heart rate increased even doing paperwork. Sexual assault nurse examiners are another population that some studies have been done in. Raunick did a fantastic study where she actually looked at levels of vicarious trauma as measured by the trauma attachment belief scale. And she looked across both SANEs and also women health nurse practitioners, and found that those that had the SANE job had higher levels of vicarious trauma than ones that didn't. But what was interesting on this one is that those that had actually experienced a personal history of trauma actually showed highest levels of vicarious trauma, and it did not matter what part of the job that they did. And in this cohort of women that were studied, 55% of them had actually experienced trauma themselves. So that was an interesting statistic. and might actually be interesting to see, why some people are drawn to a certain job. Another study, a qualitative one done in nurses, actually stated that nurses or SANEs that worked with younger victims exhibited more trauma. And what was the hardest for them was when they had no ability to actually follow up. So this just kind of shows that nurse examiners actually do see themselves as patient care first and forensic scientists maybe second. They do want to have offer the best patient care possible. And when they're not able to, it actually does lead to a lot of challenges and discomfort in their own ability to do their jobs. So medical examiners and coroners, actually a systematic review done in 2018, over 27 years of literature actually showed that only 0.3% of coroners have ever been surveyed. And that just shows that there is a lack of awareness that perhaps this is a population that should be looked at, because they do have to look at a lot of traumatic reports and a lot of traumatic information on a daily basis. Brandolo is another fantastic researcher that has a really good body of work with medical examiners, and her studies have indicated that medical examiners definitely experience alienation, distress intolerance, and an inability to actually cope. And so Brandolo actually developed a case exposure scale and family contact scale to actually link those two together. And she found that those that had more experience or more exposure to families had more alienation, and actually they even felt more stigmatization as compared to their first responder counterparts. There's an ongoing study actually being done here at RTI International with Dr. Jen Rainier. And this was a very large nationwide survey for medical examiners to determine what types of stress they were dealing with. And they did indicate that one of the hardest parts of the job was dealing with family members of decedents, and actually working longer than 24 hours in a row. And then just the general staff shortage that the discipline experiences. These have all been major stressors for them. And this study is interesting because this was done during the pandemic. So the survey was able to actually capture some of the stressors from COVID. And it did indicate that the higher caseloads were having an impact on stress. They were receiving less accommodations, they felt, than their other first responder counterparts. And they were actually worried to direct exposure to COVID. And there were a lot of unclear guidances on new procedures, especially during the height of the pandemic. So those were all big stressors for this population. Digital evidence examiners, so those are ones that spend more than 31 hours a week on internet crimes against children. They had a much higher level of trauma than other digital evidence examiners. And there were differences in not only trauma, but also coping strategies between those that were just at the bench and looking at the internet crimes against children content, or those that actually served as both the examiner and an investigator. And those that served both roles actually did have a much more challenging or exhibited more trauma and had a harder time with coping strategies than those that were just examiner alone. So there are a couple of studies that have been done in fingerprint examiners, and this was an interesting population because they do spend a lot of time looking at and analyzing a lot of fine detail. So Busey, Tom Busey in 2015 did a study with fingerprint examiners, and he found that examiners were fatigued and highly stressed. Their decision-making was actually impacted. And so they were impacted by, they would actually seek out different areas of a fingerprint to analyze as opposed to, they would maybe look for the easier ones and maybe avoid ones that might look like they might be more challenging. So they would not, they would avoid areas with marginal quality. And then Almazroy, actually, that one was a very interesting one that was just published. He found that when stressed, fingerprint examiners actually would make more inconclusive calls, and they also would give up a little bit earlier when they were stressed. So the impact of stress and burnout in forensic scientists, you've got the general burnout that someone might feel from having a lot of stress. And this actually leads to a low life satisfaction and higher levels of depression. Scientists who do experience these levels of burnout with noted excessive workload and quick turnaround times in testifying, they actually do have lower perception of their jobs. So it does actually impact the actual individual and the work product as well. And then what's really interesting, the study done in 2018 by Boltmer et al. Actually showed that when employees are experiencing a negative work environment and burnout, they actually had a completely unambitious attitude towards their work. But the scary part of this is that it did not actually impact their turnover. So what happened is that people were just unambitious and burned out, and they just tended to stay at the job. So that actually could have a lot of impact to jobs such as forensic science or anything in the criminal justice where there are really grave consequences for just unambitious attitudes. So this was an interesting way to look at what is the actual impact for burnout people still remaining at work. And then there's the job performance. There is the workability index. So this is a study or a survey that can actually, or an instrument that studies the perception of one's ability to do their own job. And it considers the demands of the job, workers' health, diagnoses done by medical professionals, and what resources they feel they have available. So just quickly, I'm going to go over the research study that I launched last year. And so this is a study to determine the effects of stress and trauma on forensic scientists. Basically, 2 research questions. First one, what is the prevalence of vicarious trauma and or burnout in forensic scientists? And the second research question is, what is the impact of vicarious trauma and burnout experienced by forensic scientists on their perceived ability to do their job? So the study design, I looked at, I used the Brondolo case exposure scale, a modified version of that. I also used the trauma attachment belief scale to specifically measure vicarious trauma. And then I looked at the burnout scale, the Oldenburg burnout inventory, to determine any level of burnout. And then I did the workability index. So that is, again, the perception of one's ability to perform their work duties. This was a quantitative study done with Psych Data Online Survey web tool. 134 questions, took generally less than 25 minutes, was open for about 8 weeks, and 736 individuals started the survey for a total of 585 who completed it. General demographics of the study, there's a large cohort of females, so 77.1 were females. About half of them were between 31 to 45 years old. 66% were either married or in a domestic partnership. More than half were parents, and a quarter of them actually had their own history of personal trauma, abuse, or even assault. So the work demographics, or the forensic discipline demographics, actually what's interesting here is that 87.7% primarily work at the bench and computer. And this could have some overlap, as many crime scene investigators and medical legal death investigators might have checked this box as well, because they do have to do a lot of report writing. But it's a good majority of bench or computer scientists in this cohort. About 90% had a master's or a bachelor's degree. More than 80% were currently practicing. About a third of them had 11 to 20 years, so this was a pretty experienced group. And 93.2% were non-sworn civilian, so that's just to delineate that this is for the non-sworn civilian and less for the law enforcement study. And most were first shift. So for their case exposure, this was interesting. About 42.6% here work on robbery or fraud cases weekly. So a lot of their caseload tends to be property crimes. And then the other larger ones that we saw on a weekly basis was adult homicide and adult sexual assault or sexual abuse. So several times a year, this was interesting to see how many times a year different types of cases these examiners would experience. There tended to be a lot of infant cases, a lot of infant child homicides or physical or sexual abuse, same with adult abuse. And I thought what was interesting in this one too is that several times per year, about 36% of the respondents actually experience multiple fatalities, so between 2 and 9 deaths in one event. Their level of burnout, actually about 1/3 of them exhibited moderate burnout. And then this burnout inventory actually has two subscales. So one is for overall exhaustion and the other one is for overall disengagement. And it does seem that a good third of them are just exhausted. So 35% exhibit just exhaustion, whereas only 21% felt actual disengagement from the job. So this shows that, you know, there is a lot of workload with forensic scientists and that this might be leading to exhaustion as opposed to, you know, just disengagement. But there is a good percentage, a good third of them that are just experiencing burnout in general. So for the workability index, about 66% actually perceive their ability to do their work to be anywhere in the good to excellent range. So this is also takes into account actual illnesses diagnosed by doctors or sick days that they've taken. And so most 66% perceive their ability to do their job to be good, but a third of them perceive their ability to do their job to be either moderate or poor. So there are a good third of the population or the respondents that do consider their burnout or what they're experiencing to actually be affecting their ability to do their jobs. So just in brief conclusion here, this overall trends from the current study indicate that this is probably one of the larger studies that measures the impact of stress and burnout in bench forensic scientists. So I'm excited to continue looking at the conclusions because of that. And then outside of studies performed in SANES, which usually are primarily female, or women's health nurses, this is one of the largest studies measuring the impact of stress and burnout in female forensic scientists. So a lot of the studies that are currently published do study this in a lot of males just because of the sworn status or the crime scene investigator status, but this one is primarily female. Many of them are working on a lot of property cases, which could be adding to their sense of exhaustion. And then about a third of them do exhibit moderate burnout. And they do perceive, a third of them do perceive that they have a moderate to poor work ability. So just future directions, I am still in the middle of analyzing the vicarious trauma portion of the study. So that's still in process. So be on the lookout for those results in the future, near future. And then I will be looking at a full statistical analysis. Again, these were trends, but I will be looking to see if case exposure is what's impacting trauma and if burnout and trauma are comorbid together. But one thing to note that there are still a lot of studies that need to be done to measure the impact of stress and trauma across forensic scientists. It's still lacking in the literature, and it is definitely something important because decision-making, workability, these actually have implications across the entire justice system. So with that, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nelson Santos. I'm a principal scientist at RTI International. I'm going to be serving as the moderator for the Q&A portion of the webinar. Let me start off by thanking Mandy and Danya for a very interesting and very complimentary, I thought, webinar where you had the practical aspects that Mandy brought in, and then Danya really provided some strong research that supports a lot of the things that are being done. We have a lot of attendees to this webinar. We usually take questions until the top of the hour, but if we have more questions than we can get to, we'll extend for another 15 minutes. For those of you who can hang on, for those of you who cannot, all this information is archived and you can see those responses. So let me start with the question. And the first one is to you, Mandy. Would you be willing to share the mental wellness checklist you used during your onboarding?
Sure, absolutely. If anyone would like to reach out to me, I can send it to you directly in email, and then that way I can continue to engage if you have questions.
Excellent. That was a softball there, Mandy. Let's see if we
Thanks.
get it. All right, this is for either one of you. Do you have any recommendations for strengthening community or personal relationships? The assumption that forensic pathologists and professionals spend all their time with dead can be stigmatized and cause isolation. Who wants that one?
Danya, would you like me to take that one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So my suggestion for that situation, I definitely understand it, working in this field and under the medical examiner's office for so many years. What I've seen that has helped that is the continual conversation and engagement. So rather than hiding behind an email and a report, having those medical legal death professionals, the pathologists, the autopsy technicians, having face-to-face conversations with law enforcement, with the attorneys. The death investigators get the exposure in the field with all the families, so they definitely get to expose themselves as, you know, definitely having a community focus. It's those other individuals behind the scenes that don't. So taking every opportunity to do that, provide presentations. You make yourself a little bit more well-known and communicate to all of those individuals, and all that's going to do is grow exposure into there's a whole lot more than investigating the dead in this field.
Very good. All right, next one's for you, Danya. Have there been any studies of the influence of news media coverage on forensic science and lab oversight on stress and performance of forensic scientists?
Let's see, influence. Actually, I have not seen any studies, or not recently since I've done this literature review on the influence of the news media coverage of forensic scientists. I know one of the stressors that crime scene investigators have experienced, and this is noted in the literature, is just being at a scene where there are a lot of people, or especially if there are families of victims or even the victims themselves. That is a large stressor, but I have not seen anything specifically related to the media. But that would be a really interesting question there as well.
Okay, Mandy. Would you be willing, oh, sorry, did that one. What impact, if any, do you believe that casework demands such as backlog, casework management, and deadlines has on team members in regards to trauma or burnout?
I think it has a very large impact. I spoke a lot about the trauma of the type of casework that we're dealing with here and what we're exposed to all of the time. However, that more administrative aspect plays a huge role. The pressure that a scientist puts on themselves to feel they need to make sure that they're maintaining something that they've either set for themselves or they feel their leader has set for them definitely will take a toll on the individual mentally. So that is more with that tone at the top and having leaders in positions that are doing that walk around and being aware. So when you see your team members starting to be stressed out, it could be because of you. Maybe you asked a question and they interpreted it differently than you meant it. So having that constant interaction, because all of those things, backlogs, deadlines, court trials, those definitely have an impact on the minds of those scientists.
Very good. Danya, are there any studies for drug analysts or toxicologists? We don't tend to have traumatic experience, but are in very high throughput sections. We're constantly pushed to get more and more done.
Yeah, so there are very few studies when it comes to some of the bench scientists. This is one of the reasons why I was really interested in expanding this study to my fellow DNA people out there, also chemists, because a lot of times they are a little bit overlooked, especially in a high throughput arena. If you're doing just case after case, and maybe not even looking at the actual case notes themselves sometimes, or the traumatic material. So this is one of the reasons why I thought burnout would really be of interest to study, because I know, with the demands of the job and the quick turnaround times that are expected, that must have an impact specifically to those bench scientists. So I think as it stands, this is, as far as I can see from the literature currently, this is one of the larger studies that does actually look at a lot of the chemist and DNA population.
Very good. All right, this is for either of you. What references, resources would you suggest that those with PTSD or STS could provide their DBT therapists to help patients with their recovery?
That's a harder one for me too, Wendy. I know you started off with the disclaimer that you're not a mental health, practitioner, and neither am I. One of the things I know that does exist, I believe OVC might have a trauma toolkit on their website. That one could be a really nice starting point to see what resources they're offering. I know, Mandy, you mentioned a lot of the meditation and yoga. Those have been shown to be effective. And one of the things I know the literature has actually shown across other disciplines, not just forensic sciences, but having the interpersonal ability at work to actually engage in conversations, allowing for staff members to kind of debrief with each other. I know Mandy and we spoke before this webinar, just kind of touching base, and we agreed that the ability to actually decompress with people who know your same challenges at work. It's really hard sometimes for forensic scientists to go home and bring that home to a spouse or a loved one or a family member, because they just don't understand it. But other people at work understand the same work demands. And that's one of the reasons why things like, even gallows humor, like the dark humor, is somewhat acceptable in a work setting to a certain level where it might not be accepted elsewhere. Mandy, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, I would actually just add, in addition to what Danya had stated, is keep in mind that it's not a one size fits all. So there are a variety of things that might be helpful. Having any individual that's associated with your office that is maybe taking, providing care for your team members, have them reach out to additional trauma specialized individuals, because those do exist. Making sure that you provide resources to your team that are going to be valuable for them is going to keep them on board. It's going to allow them, because they're in a very tough situation, to stay on track. So making sure that that person has extra training in trauma therapy is going to be helpful, because they do have a level of understanding then that's going to be more accepting to the person, and it might allow them to engage a little bit more.
Very good. Diana, this one's for you. Was your study able to quantify the volume of cases versus type of cases that examiners were exposed to?
No. So the case exposure scale just generally asks specifically how much per week or per year or do they encounter. So it did not ask specifically the volume, but that would be a good follow-up study, I would say.
Yeah, sounds like you got a bunch of places to go with a follow-up study. I see a lot of potential there. Okay, let's see. Next question for Mandy. What would your advice be to agencies who may not have the tone at the top support you mentioned? Great question.
My best advice for that would be stay the course. Keep in mind that a leader is not a position or title. It's an action or an example. So that being said, there are a lot of individuals under my own walls here that are leaders, and they don't have a position or title or an office of their own. So the fact that you do have those other individuals in your organization, that helps to craft the culture as well. So while tone at the top is really important and it is valuable, if it's not there, continue to move forward, continue to try to implement that for the team, continue to try to communicate to everyone that we are stronger together. And all of those individuals will get on board with that and still feel that sense of community and that sense that they have someplace to go. It definitely is a challenge if that behavior is not there at the top, but that does not mean it's a stopping point.
Excellent. Okay, Danya, was your survey sent to specific labs, or was it completely random depending on if you heard about the survey?
So I guess it was pushed through on a couple of newsletters. I think the FTCOE pushed it out a couple of times. ASCLAD also pushed it out on their newsletter, and then through social media and just the snowballing recruitment, really. So not to any specific lab, no.
So just general outreach. Okay, this is for either of you. Are there examples of the results of such studies being used for changing or implementing new policies to improve working conditions, mental health of forensic scientists?
Danya, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I can't think of one that actually has done like a pre and post test on that. So I can't think of any in the literature that's actually done a robust study on that. Mandy, do you know of any?
No, I have not seen any either. And I can speak for my own experiences that, especially now in our infancy, which we're trying to still grow and develop this culture for ourselves, it's not something where I have taken statistics on that. So for example, if I throw out 10 different options or resources for people or ideas, and one person out of 100 accepts that, I won. So it doesn't so much matter to me that the percentage of somebody who had tried that is beneficial or they're continuing with it. One person did, and that was the goal.
And I do know that the Rainier study that I mentioned that's being done at RTI, there is an associated guided meditation app that is being implemented as a study, but those results are still underway. So that's the closest one I can think of, maybe.
Yeah, it appears that this area of study has a lot of potential as well. Not a lot out there. Interesting. All right, Mandy, does your lab have elements for wellness, stress, burnout included in your health and safety manual? Are you aware of labs in general that include those topics?
We do not have that in our own health and safety manuals. We keep that mostly to the peer support. So we have a peer support area on our teams section for the entire office where they can access resources. And that is from my amazing team that has built all of those resources to put them at people's fingertips. That is in addition to everything we send out through me on Fridays for newsletters. I have not run into laboratories that I have physically seen all of these things as aspects of their health and safety programs specifically, but a lot of them have structured them as a mental wellness and peer support manual on itself. So while we have not finalized anything like that for my department, that's something that we have been working on. I just have not seen it as part of their health and safety programs.
Okay, thank you. Well, Danya, we talked a little bit about follow-up studies. What would you think is a good follow-up study to your research?
I think specifically doing something on the decision making. I know I mentioned a couple of studies in the fingerprint realm by Busey and Al Mazroi, two separate studies, but same population. And it was really interesting, those studies, because it actually, the Al Mazroi study actually indicated that when forensic scientists, or at least fingerprint examiners, are really stressed, they actually tended to do a little bit better, actually, in some of their calls. They did a lot more inconclusives, but it is something to be said about like a certain amount of stress is kind of where the sweet spot is. And so, but when you go beyond that, you actually saw in the study that people dropped out of the study. If they felt too stressed, they dropped out of the study. And it was a really interesting way that Dr. Al Mazroi actually stressed this population out. It was by giving some negative reinforcement through, doing a pre-test where you get math questions wrong and it tells you in big red, like you got that wrong, or it gives you a stressor, a time stressor that you're not making the time requirement for the test. So, there was a definite level of stress, but what was interesting is that there is some sort of a sweet spot of that stress actually can positively impact decision making, and then it just kind of tanks and falls off, and then there's a lot of what seems to be just exhaustion, burnout, or they just give up entirely. So I think seeing decision making with populations of individuals that are experiencing burnout, and not just stress, but burnout, like long-term burnout, would be actually a really interesting study, I believe.
Yeah, personally, I would say that stress thing when testifying was always something I always looked to. If I was relaxed, I didn't feel I did as well as when I was a little stressed out and nervous. I thought I performed better. So
Yes.
It's interesting that a little bit of stress is good for decision making.
Actually, and I do have a follow-up. I know on the question before about putting things into policies and manuals. So one of the things that was brought up to my attention is that there is an ISO accreditation actually for mental health wellness for workers. It's ISO 45003. I was just recently made aware with this actually through a discussion with Dr. Almazroy. What would be actually interesting would be a pre and post study, I would think, on the implementation of this accreditation standard. You know, when forensic scientists, we love our accreditation, you know, getting that stamp of approval. I mean, and I get it, I believe in it too. And so being able to kind of put your resources, your money where your mouth is, that you do believe that mental health is really important for the workforce, accrediting your laboratory to that standard, and then seeing, is there any positive impact before the accreditation and the, you know, implementation of this standard, and then after. So that would be another study. I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I've got 2 questions I'm going to put together here, Danya, based for your study. Have you considered adding forensic toxicology, and did your study include a free answer section?
So we did have toxicologists answer the survey. I did lump a lot of the chemists together, whether that's a taboo or not. Again, these are trends. I can always pull those aside. But so yes, toxicologists are included in this one. And sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Did your survey include a free answer section?
Yeah, so we did have I did have a pre-answer question that just wanted to make sure that I ruled out anyone that did not have any experience in the forensic sciences. And I also wanted to know whether or not the respondents were still currently practicing, or had they practiced and then left for a particular reason. So I did ask that question of, you know, did you practice before, and did you leave for your own perceived stressors of the job, or was it to just pursue some ancillary career in the justice system?
A lot of these questions are for you, Donnie. We've got about 13 minutes left. Did you see any trends for the prevalence, severity of vicarious trauma and STS in individuals who had past personal traumatic experience?
So I haven't, again, I haven't completed the vicarious trauma analysis. It was the largest of the subscales that I looked at. All the questions were about 134 questions, I believe I said before, and 84 of them were just on the vicarious trauma. And it actually, the trauma attachment belief scale, the TAB scale, is one that's actually used by practicing licensed therapists to be able to diagnose vicarious trauma. So it is a little bit more challenging to go through that analysis with the 584 respondents. And so what I did find interesting, though, was that 1/4 of the respondents did indicate through just their own self-admission that they did have some sort of history themselves of trauma or assault. And you know, it's interesting, a couple of years ago I would have thought that was a high number, but when you actually look at the national standard, and when I was looking at some of the studies, especially the one that I mentioned before with Roundnick, of, you know, almost half of the respondents of the nurse practitioners experienced trauma themselves. It does appear, you know, that, you know, the numbers are in line with the national standard for, you know, any type of past trauma in general, and then certainly ones that involve females, and then also ones that might be drawn to this type of profession. So I think that that does kind of fall in line with other literature as well.
Okay. Here's one for you, Mandy. How do you approach top management who contributes significantly to the pressure subordinates feel? However, they don't see themselves as a problem? That's a classic.
That is a classic, yes. And that's a tough one. That is something, you know, if someone is convinced that their actions are not detrimental, it's very hard to convince them otherwise. However, that's where a lot of that community support are definitely going to come in. So, you know, being a team and being to make sure to pick each other up, that will help. The other thing that's great for agencies to have sometimes is a leader getting that feedback. They may not realize until it is right in their face that they actually are having a detrimental impact on how they say something. So a lot of it really could be ignorance. They are just unaware. So having some mechanism for feedback to that leader. Not everyone's comfortable to walk into a leader's office. So having some mechanism where you can give an anonymous suggestion or, you know, some type of a response. So that way they're getting that feedback and making themselves a little bit more self-aware, and that might help to improve the issue. But if that's something that's not going to be a particular solution for that person, making sure that you have that community of everyone else, so that you're staying on task, you realize there is a goal, but there's a certain way to reach that goal, and picking each other up to get to that end point.
Maybe having them read the outward mindset too, it might help a little bit in understanding someone's point of view. Tanya, along the lines of the media coverage question, are there any survey questions that would speak to stress and burnout related to the many facets of criticism forensic science has seen since the NAS report and the fact that we work in a very aggressive adversarial system?
Actually, yeah, I do believe that there's been literature looking at the fact that some of the stress is because of the adversarial system, and also, the fact that, there is no ground truth, right? You can't, you can't really prove a ground truth just with forensic evidence. And then having to defend that with statistics. I know there have been studies on, just testimony in general, having to be able to attest to a scientific principle that maybe that maybe it's hard for the jury and or the defense or prosecution to fully understand what you're trying to convey, or that they're misconstruing how you're saying things, how you have to say things, and whether or not they're drawing conclusions that you wouldn't necessarily want to make yourself. You would not say in the way that they're coming to that conclusion. So there is literature that does study a lot of that aspect of it. So it wasn't included in this particular presentation, but it's out there.
Okay, this one's for either of you. Do you have any tips for protecting your own mental space while trying to be supportive of other coworkers going through tough time at work, personal life? It can be draining and balanced and leaves others walking on eggshells.
That's definitely true. That definitely can be the situation. It's important to be honest beyond all others with yourself. So when you realize and feel yourself getting to that point, you have to take a step back and make the comment in your own head that you're not helping that person. The fact that you don't have anything more to give, you're only hurting yourself and them, because you're not there for them really. So one thing is, you can respectfully say to them, and eventually, maybe at that moment they might not get it, but eventually they're going to get it, and they're going to understand, okay, wait a minute, I see why she took a step back and she needed a moment. Maybe she just couldn't handle it right now. And that is completely fine. That is exactly why I also mentioned about helping the helpers, because that's not uncommon. Anyone who finds themselves in that position and they're feeling that pressure on themselves, you're not alone. So there are other people that can definitely understand, and it resonates with them what you're saying.
Anything else to add, Donnie, or is that?
No, I'm as a researcher, I have a different, perspective. I don't usually have to play in that field of direct trauma or vicarious trauma myself. So I wouldn't have anything to say other than sometimes people make me mad by email and I get frustrated and I feel burned out too, but for different reasons.
Okay, this one kind of relates to the decision-making follow-up, which was about specific to latent prints and them having a lot of inconclusives. And they said, would it be interesting to see a correlation between burnout and non-conformances? Has other disciplines been studied? Do you know, Tanya?
I have only seen the two on specific decision making that I noted there, and it was in latent print examiners. I also, after reading those studies, think that would be a fantastic follow-up study for any of the disciplines, non-conformance included. I know in the DNA realm too, being able to look at some of the more complex mixture analysis, kinship analysis, will that actually affect it as well? And just generally, making any type of call or decision. I believe our RTI is doing a study, I think, with crime scene investigators with NIST right now, with looking at eye tracking for crime scene investigators, where they're looking. It would be really interesting to see, the more stressed someone is, even in a scene. Are they looking in the right places? Are they trying to avoid and just go through quicker? There's a lot of follow-on studies that can be done, I think, when it comes to the actual impact stress and how that's actually affecting decisions.
Definitely. So this for either one of you, has there been any studies comparing the medical benefits that first responders receive for mental health versus the benefits lab receive for mental health? I think we need to be afforded the same access with minimal costs incurred to us to those resources.
Yeah, I could not agree more with that one. I know there have been, so a lot of the first responder resources that became available actually happened after September 11th. And what's interesting is, and I believe it's a previous webinar that is on the website through FTCOE, but the Brondolo study that I mentioned, one of the ways that reasons I got interested in this study was actually a discussion with her. She, her husband was is a New York City police officer that actually served during September 11th, and was working those scenes and whatnot. And he actually noticed that all of his peers were offered a lot of mental health support after the event. They had a ton of resources that were made available to them because they, I think the entire country understood the pressures that happened there. However, he was the one that noted and told his researcher spouse, Dr. Brondolo, that the medical examiner community was not getting the same level of support. And they were experiencing, just as much, or very similar levels of trauma from what they had to process with that scene, and not to mention the amount and workload and some of the gruesome scenes, and also dealing with the family members as well of having to work that angle. And so it was that that event that actually got Dr. Brondolo, Elizabeth Brondolo, into the research arena that she has now made a really great impact in with medical examiners. But I think everyone can agree that this is, when you think about the forensic discipline and the fact that they are also, involved in all of this type of traumatic content, and a lot of times cannot even follow through or follow up because they do their one job, and sometimes they're pulled away from that case file, and they never have closure on that. Sometimes it's actually the lack of closure that is hardest for people. So yes, I agree, it's lacking. And I do think that it needs to be on the same exact level as first responder counterparts.
Okay, and I think we'll end on that one. We've got to most of the questions. I appreciate both of you being patient and answering all those questions. You did a fantastic job. For those of you who want to reach out to them after this, the slide will show up with their contact information. And again, this will all be archived so you can see the questions and answers again. But thank you all, and thank you all for attending our session.
Thank you.
Before you leave today's webinar, I'd like to draw your attention to our feedback form. It takes less than 5 minutes to complete and can be accessed via the checkbox icon directly above the chat. Your honest feedback is invaluable as we continually search for ways to improve and provide the best experience possible. Lastly, across the top of the live stream window are links to our social media profiles, including Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. There is also a link to the FTCOE website, the Just Science podcast, and the FTCOE newsletter registration. Like, follow, or subscribe to stay up to date with everything the FTCOE is doing in support of the forensic community. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great day.